In the Soviet Union, power was never just held. It was guarded, watched, recorded, and when necessary taken back. If you want to understand how a one-party state could rule a sixth of the Earth's landmass through revolution, war, famine, industrialization, and nuclear brinkmanship, you do not start with tanks or speeches. You start with files. You start with the men who carried keys to locked rooms and who decided which rumors became evidence. You start with the organization that, by the second half of the 20th century, embodied the USSR's nervous system, the KGB. KGB did not appear out of nowhere. Its name Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, the Committee for State Security, was created in 1954, but it was the inheritor of a lineage that ran straight through the early Bolshevik state. The Cheka, formed in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, established the template, a political police institution empowered to investigate, arrest, and eliminate enemies, defined less by what they did than by what they represented. Over the decades, names changed: GPU, OGPU, NKVD, NKGB, MGB, yet the core logic remained. The Soviet state did not merely fear invasion. It feared contamination, dissent, alternative loyalties, uncontrolled information. The KGB was the Cold War-era expression of that older instinct, updated for a world of radio broadcasts, jet aircraft, and nuclear weapons. The first fact about the KGB, then, is that it was simultaneously an intelligence service, a secret police, a border guard empire, and a political instrument. Unlike many Western services that were separated into distinct agencies, the KGB combined foreign espionage with domestic surveillance, counterintelligence, communications security, and the protection of party leadership. Its chairman reported to the Communist Party's top leadership, and the organization's priorities were shaped by the party's understanding of threats. The KGB's job was not simply to catch spies. It was to make the state feel safe even when the state's own policies generated the insecurity. When the KGB was established in March 1954, it was not a liberal reform. It was a reorganization after Stalin's death, a redistribution of coercive power so that no single security boss could again dominate the system the way Lavrentiy Beria had briefly threatened to do in 1953. Beria, who had run the NKVD during parts of the Great Terror and the wartime security apparatus, was arrested in June 1953 and executed that December. The Soviet leadership had learned a lesson. The security apparatus was necessary, but it had to be controlled. Creating the KGB under the Council of Ministers was a way to formalize that control while keeping the machinery intact. The KGB's structure reflected the Soviet obsession with categorizing threats. Foreign intelligence, known as the First Chief Directorate, stole secrets abroad. Counterintelligence, the Second Chief Directorate, hunted foreign spies at home. The Third Chief Directorate watched the armed forces. Other directorates guarded borders, monitored communications, investigated anti-Soviet agitation, and protected the leadership. The famous Fifth Directorate, created in 1967, specialized in the suppression of ideological dissenters, scientists, nationalists, religious activists. The KGB's reach extended from embassies in Washington and London to apartment stairwells in Kiev and Tbilisi, from the Berlin Wall to the Arctic coastline. It was a bureaucracy of suspicion. One of the most revealing facts about the KGB is that it thrived on informants. It did not need every citizen to be an agent. It needed enough people, in enough workplaces and social circles, to make privacy feel risky. The Soviet system had long relied on agentura, networks of secret collaborators who provided reports. The KGB cultivated sources in factories, universities, writers' unions, scientific institutes, and even within the party itself. The point was not merely to discover plots. It was to map relationships and identify potential disloyalty before it became organized opposition. In a state that claimed to represent the working class, the security apparatus treated society as terrain to be monitored and controlled. The paranoia was not invented from nothing. The USSR had endured real threats: civil war, foreign intervention after 1917, sabotage fears during rapid industrialization, a catastrophic invasion in 1941, and then a Cold War in which the United States and its allies did, in fact, run espionage operations, and attempted covert actions against Soviet interests. The Soviet leadership interpreted this history through a lens that made compromise look like weakness. Every crisis reinforced the idea that enemies were everywhere. The KGB did not just reflect that worldview, it institutionalized it, turning fear into procedure. Foreign espionage became the KGB's glamorous face, the world of illegals living under false identities and diplomats meeting sources in parks. But the KGB's overseas mission was always tied to the Soviet state's strategic needs: military technology, nuclear secrets, political influence, and early warning of Western intentions. During the Cold War, Soviet intelligence targeted NATO plans, missile deployments, and scientific research. It also tried to shape politics abroad through covert support for friendly parties and movements, a practice that mirrored Western covert operations. The KGB's foreign intelligence officers were trained to recruit agents, handle clandestine communications, and exploit ideological sympathies, especially among those who saw the USSR as an anti-fascist, anti-colonial alternative. Yet the KGB's domestic mission was arguably more consequential for Soviet society. The USSR was not a democracy with competing parties. It was a system where political legitimacy depended on unity and control. When dissent appeared, it was treated as a security threat. The KGB monitored samizdat self-published underground literature because uncontrolled writing meant uncontrolled thought. It watched religious communities because loyalty to God could be framed as competition with loyalty to the party. It tracked national movements in the Baltic republics, Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia because nationalism threatened the integrity of the Union. The KGB's files became a shadow biography of the country, recording who said what, who met whom, who read which banned book. The Soviet leadership's fear of information was not abstract. In the 20th century, information was power in the most literal sense. Nuclear weapons made miscalculation fatal, military technology could determine survival, and ideological legitimacy so central to the Soviet system could be undermined by narratives that the party could not control. The KGB worked to manage all three: secrets, weapons, and belief. Nowhere did these pressures converge more dramatically than in the Cold War's most dangerous standoff, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. To understand the KGB's role in that era, you have to understand the Soviet state's strategic paranoia and how intelligence shaped decision-making when the world moved within days of nuclear war. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the USSR faced a grim geographic reality. The United States had deployed nuclear missiles in allied countries close to Soviet territory. Thor missiles were based in England beginning in 1959 under Project Emily. In 1961, Jupiter missiles were deployed in Italy and Turkey, and those in Turkey were within range of Moscow. From the Soviet perspective, this was not theoretical. It was a direct threat that compressed warning times and made the Kremlin feel exposed. The United States, for its part, framed these deployments as deterrence and alliance reassurance. But deterrence, when viewed through the eyes of an adversary, can look like preparation for a first strike. At the same time, Cuba had become a focal point of Cold War confrontation. After Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, the island's alignment with the Soviet Union alarmed Washington. The United States trained a paramilitary force of Cuban exiles, and the CIA led an attempt to invade and overthrow Cuba's government. After that failure, the U.S. government pursued a violent campaign of sabotage and terrorism against Cuba beginning in November, part of what was known as the Cuban Project, continuing through the early 1960s. For Havana, the threat of another invasion was not paranoia, it was policy. For Moscow, Cuba was both an opportunity and a risk, a socialist ally 90 miles from Florida, but also a potential flashpoint that could drag the USSR into direct confrontation. There was another layer, the Sino-Soviet split. By the early 1960s, relations between Moscow and Beijing were increasingly fractious. The Soviet leadership worried about Cuba drifting toward China, which positioned itself as a more militant revolutionary model. In that context, supporting Cuba was not only about confronting the United States, it was about maintaining Soviet leadership within the communist world. prestige mattered, and prestige was a strategic asset. In July 1962, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro agreed to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter a future U.S. invasion. This was a high-stakes gamble. It promised to alter the strategic balance by placing Soviet missiles close to American territory, matching at least psychologically the American missiles near the USSR. Construction of launch facilities began, but secrecy was fragile. In October, a U-2 spy plane captured photographic evidence of medium and long-range missile sites. The crisis lasted 13 days, from 16 to 28 October 1962, and it is widely considered the closest the Cold War came to full-scale nuclear war. This is where intelligence and paranoia collide. The United States responded by convening the National Security Council and key advisors in the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOMM. President John F. Kennedy was advised to carry out an airstrike on Cuban soil, followed by an invasion. He chose a less aggressive course to avoid a declaration of war. On 22 October, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to prevent further missiles from reaching Cuba, carefully calling it a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of a blockade as an act of war. The Soviet Union, facing American naval power and global scrutiny, had to decide whether to force the line. KGB reporting, Soviet military intelligence, diplomatic cables, and leadership instincts all fed into Moscow's decision-making. The Soviet system's fear was not only that the United States might invade Cuba, but that the United States might interpret Soviet missiles as the start of a larger offensive. In nuclear strategy, perception can kill as surely as a warhead. The crisis ended with a bargain. The USSR would dismantle its offensive weapons in Cuba under United Nations verification in exchange for a U.S. public declaration not to invade Cuba again. Privately, the United States agreed to dismantle the offensive weapons it had deployed to Turkey. The Thor missiles in the United Kingdom were disbanded by August 1963. The U.S. quarantine remained until 20 November 1962, ending after offensive missiles and bombers were withdrawn, though some Soviet bombers had remained in Cuba for a time. The consequences were enormous. The crisis led to the Moscow-Washington hotline because both sides recognized that slow, indirect communication could trigger catastrophe. It also reshaped internal Soviet politics. The compromise embarrassed Khrushchev because the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey was secret. Publicly, it looked like the USSR backed down from a crisis it had started. According to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, the outcome was seen by top Soviet leadership as a blow to prestige bordering on humiliation. Khrushchev's fall from power in 1964 was influenced in part by that embarrassment and by perceptions that he had handled the crisis ineptly. In a system like the USSR, where legitimacy was tied to strength, humiliation was not just personal, it was political. The KGB's world was built on that same logic: strength, secrecy, and the management of perception. After 1962, Soviet leaders understood that nuclear brinkmanship required not only missiles, but reliable intelligence and controlled escalation. The KGB and military intelligence were expected to provide warning, to interpret enemy intentions, and to prevent surprises. But there was a trap. When an institution is built to expect hostility, it can interpret ambiguous signals as confirmation of worst fears. The KGB's effectiveness was always entangled with the Soviet system's tendency to see conspiracies. In Eastern Europe, the KGB's influence extended through allied security services. The Soviet Union maintained a security architecture across the Warsaw Pact, and while each state had its own secret police, East Germany's Stasi, Poland's SB, Czechoslovakia's St. Romania's Securitate, the Soviet services played a guiding role. The purpose was not only to protect against Western intelligence, but to keep the socialist bloc politically aligned with Moscow. When unrest erupted, the security services were both censors and weapons. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956, though predating the KGB's most mature period, cast a long shadow. Soviet forces crushed the uprising, and the lesson for the bloc was brutal: Political deviation could be treated as counter-revolution. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Prague Spring Reform movement under Alexander Dubček triggered a Warsaw Pact invasion in August. The KGB and allied services viewed reform not as domestic experimentation, but as a breach that the West could exploit. The Brezhnev Doctrine asserting the right to intervene when socialism was threatened was enforced not only by tanks, but by surveillance, arrests, and the long-term intimidation of intellectuals and activists. The KGB's ideology was that political pluralism was not a legitimate choice. It was an opening for enemy penetration. Inside the USSR, the KGB's most visible domestic targets in the 1960s and 1970s were dissidents who challenged the state's narrative. The Soviet Union signed international agreements that implied respect for human rights, but it also treated human rights activism as subversion. Writers, scientists, and campaigners were monitored, interrogated, fired from jobs, exiled internally, or prosecuted under laws against anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. The KGB did not need mass terror on Stalin's scale to be effective. Selective repression, combined with career control and social pressure, could isolate dissent and warn the wider population. One of the KGB's most chilling tools was the use of psychiatry against political opponents, a practice documented in the late Soviet period. Declaring dissent a mental illness reframed political conflict as pathology. It also allowed the state to claim humanitarian motives while neutralizing critics. The long-term effect was corrosive. It damaged trust in medical institutions and demonstrated that the state could redefine reality with bureaucratic authority. The KGB also guarded the Soviet border with a scale that underscored how the state understood freedom of movement. Border troops were part of the KGB, and the Soviet frontier was treated as a military line, not a simple administrative boundary. Preventing defections mattered because defections were not only intelligence losses, they were propaganda disasters. Every defector was a story the West could tell about why people wanted to leave. The KGB's job was to stop that story from being written. Defections, when they occurred, exposed the fragility of secrecy. The Cold War saw high-profile cases on both sides, and each one intensified suspicion. In a system already inclined to paranoia, a defection could trigger internal purges, tighten travel rules, and harsher vetting. The KGB's counterintelligence mission was relentless because the leadership believed that Western services were always trying to penetrate the Soviet state, recruit insiders, and steal technology. This was not merely paranoia. The West did run such operations, but the Soviet response often expanded beyond genuine threats into the policing of loyalty as a general condition of employment. Technology theft became a strategic priority. The USSR achieved remarkable scientific feats: Sputnik in 1957, Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961, but it also struggled with consumer technology and certain advanced industrial systems. Intelligence collection abroad was used to close gaps. The KGB and military intelligence targeted aerospace, electronics, computing, and military research. The consequence was a paradox. Stolen technology could accelerate specific programs, but it could not fully replace an innovation ecosystem constrained by censorship, bureaucratic fear, and the punishment of failure. When engineers know that mistakes can be treated as disloyalty, they become cautious. The KGB's presence could protect secrets, but it could also suffocate initiative. The KGB's role in leadership protection. The Ninth Directorate reveals another fact. The Soviet leadership feared not only foreign attack, but domestic betrayal. Security around the Kremlin, around dachas, around travel routes was intense. This was a state born from revolution and civil war, ruled by men who knew how quickly power could be lost. The security apparatus was both shield and warning. The leadership was separate from society, physically and psychologically. That separation fed the cycle of mistrust. A leadership that does not trust its population builds an apparatus to watch it, and that apparatus generates reports that confirm the leadership's fears. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the KGB under Yuri Andropov became even more central. Andropov, who chaired the KGB from 1967 to 1982, was not merely a police chief, he was a political strategist. He understood the USSR's economic stagnation and the legitimacy crisis created by corruption and cynicism. Yet his methods emphasized discipline and control. The KGB under Andropov expanded efforts against dissent and tried to enforce labor discipline, targeting absenteeism and parasitism. It was an attempt to fix systemic problems with surveillance and punishment. The consequence was limited. Coercion could force compliance, but it could not generate prosperity or belief. Andropov's rise also showed how the KGB could become a pathway to supreme power. When he became General Secretary in November 1982, the security apparatus had effectively produced the country's leader. That fact alone tells you how deeply security logic had penetrated Soviet governance. Even after Andropov's death in February 1984, the KGB remained a crucial pillar, and its worldview shaped how leaders interpreted both Western actions and domestic unrest. The Soviet war in Afghanistan, beginning in December 1979, further intensified that security mindset. The intervention was justified as support for a friendly government, but it became a grinding conflict that drained resources and morale. Intelligence and security services were deeply involved, and the war fed domestic disillusionment. It also energized Islamist movements and contributed to long-term instability in the region. For the Soviet system, Afghanistan became another reason to fear infiltration, sabotage, and ideological infection. The KGB's mission expanded into a war zone where the lines between military action, intelligence, and political control blurred. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the USSR faced a crisis of sustainability. His policies of perestroika and glasnost aimed to reform the system, but reform threatened the very mechanisms the KGB had used to maintain stability. Glasnost meant more openness, more public discussion, more exposure of past crimes and present failures. For the KGB, openness was dangerous because it reduced the state's monopoly on information. Yet without openness, the system's stagnation seemed irreversible. This was the late Soviet dilemma. Control prevented collapse in the short term, but it contributed to decay in the long term. As the Soviet republics pushed for sovereignty and independence, the KGB monitored nationalist movements and political organizing, but the center's ability to enforce unity weakened. By 1991, the Soviet Union was in existential crisis. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev, and elements of the security apparatus were implicated. The coup failed, accelerating the dissolution of the USSR in December 1991. The KGB itself was broken up and reorganized into successor agencies in the Russian Federation and other newly independent states. The institution that had been built to protect the Soviet state could not save it from the contradictions that had accumulated over decades. If you step back, the KGB's history becomes a study in how a government tries to manufacture certainty in an uncertain world. It gathered intelligence, ran agents, protected leaders, guarded borders, suppressed dissent, and fought information with censorship and coercion. It operated in a Cold War environment where real enemies existed and where nuclear weapons made misreading intentions potentially fatal. It also operated within a political system that defined disagreement as danger. That combination produced an apparatus that was highly capable in some domains and deeply destructive in others. The Cuban Missile Crisis offers a concentrated example of how intelligence, fear, and prestige can push states to the edge. The USSR felt threatened by US missiles in the United Kingdom, Italy, and Turkey, and by US covert action against Cuba. It also worried about losing influence to China. Those pressures helped drive the decision in July 1962 to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. The discovery by U-2 flights in October triggered a confrontation that lasted from 16 to 28 October, during which leaders weighed airstrikes, invasion, blockade, and the unthinkable possibility of nuclear exchange. The resolution included a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret U.S. agreement to remove missiles from Turkey, with Soviet missiles dismantled under UN verification. The aftermath produced the hotline and a temporary reduction in tensions, but it also humiliated Khrushchev in the eyes of colleagues, contributing to his fall. In that story, you can see the Soviet security mindset in action: deterrence pursued through secrecy, prestige defended through risk, and internal politics shaped by the appearance of strength. The KGB's deeper legacy is not just the operations it ran, or the files it kept, or the dissidents it harassed. It is the way it trained a state to think. When a government builds its stability on surveillance and fear, it starts to interpret society as a threat rather than a partner. It starts to treat information as contraband rather than a tool for problem-solving. It starts to confuse control with competence. The modern consequence is that the habits formed in that era, secrecy, suspicion, the conflation of criticism with subversion, do not simply vanish when an institution is renamed. They can persist in successor services, political culture, and public expectations about what the state is allowed to do in the name of security. The takeaway is stark. The KGB was not a monster outside the Soviet system. It was one of the system's most logical products. It protected the USSR from real adversaries, and it also protected the party from its own people. It helped manage crises that could have ended civilization, and it enforced a domestic order that punished truth when truth became inconvenient. In the 20th century, the Soviet state tried to build an empire of certainty. The KGB was its instrument, and the record shows the cost. A society trained to whisper, a leadership trapped by its own paranoia, and a superpower that could gather secrets from the world, yet could not ultimately secure the loyalty and confidence of the nation it claimed to represent.